Hello there, and welcome to Lesson 2. So before we dive into this next lesson, I'd like to make just a few comments about the first one that I left off intentionally so that you'd have time to really absorb and reflect on the first lesson before I mention them. The first is that, and this comment is particular to the portion of the lecture on Flaubert's Un Corps Simple or Simple Heart. And this comes back to my teaching philosophy, but a part of my teaching philosophy I haven't shared with you yet, which is really just a quote. And that quote is, if you want to teach someone to fish, first teach them to love the sea, and they'll figure out how to fish. So I hope my love, my passion for Un Corps Simple came through in that lecture, in that a love of literature, a love of world literature, getting to know these cultures through their literature drives you in this class more than anything else, which leads right into my second point, which is that in the second portion of Lecture 1, I spent a lot of time on what you would probably call method, our approach to the class. But I don't want us to get too caught up in method, and I don't even know if method is the best word to describe what I tried to do in part 2 of the previous lesson. An approach, the way we come at the literature might be a better way to describe that. I feel like the word method is too technical, and I'm hoping to convey that with what I just said about teaching someone to fish, teaching them to love the sea. I want our approach to be very general. I don't want you to feel like you have a specific plug-and-play method. So in lecturing on cognitive mapping and discussing how we need to approach the text with humility, with our minds open, with the belief that we can't know everything about a culture, but we're going to learn a little bit more through its literature, that should be a very general, flexible approach, not a highly specific method, so that you can bring your own skills for analysis, your own unique approach, and kind of combine it with that general approach as you dive into, read, enjoy, and hopefully, like I said, love these texts. So I wanted to make those two notes. Now, as we dive into this next lecture, I want to point out that the first lecture was really 75% an overview of the course and our approach, and 25% analysis of literature. And in that last portion on Flaubert, really meant to be like a case study, like I said, of how we're going to approach text in this class. So with that in mind, lesson 2 is our first true lecture for the class, true in the sense of it will be similar and follow the format of all the remaining lectures. They're all true, of course, but this one is indicative of the format we'll follow, whereas the first one was not. So you can expect the individual portions of each lecture, parts 1 through 4, to be short. My goal is to keep them right around half an hour, so that you have about 2 hours total, and each one will address a piece of literature, as I did Flaubert in the last video you watched. But again, shorter than the Flaubert video because I was going with so much detail there and bringing my own research and work I had done to it to give you really in-depth introduction. All right, so with lesson 2, we're going to cover a lot of ground historically speaking. As I said, this class moves from 1650 to the present in an effort to be comprehensive and diverse with a good range of geographic and cultural diversity, but also temporal diversity. And so with this lesson, we're going to look at the earliest texts we'll see in the course. Remember, with Flaubert, we're kind of looking at that text out of time, so to speak. So now we're going to start very close to 1650 and just move forward toward the present. On that note, I want to just mention that I've worked really hard to try to figure out what are the best texts to teach from this series of centuries. Um, the Norton Anthology does a great job of selecting the greatest works, but we can only cover some of them. There'll be a lot in the textbook we don't cover. I've immediately eliminated almost all of the American and British texts in there for the reasons I stated in the previous lecture. But beyond those texts, we still have quite a few to choose from. So I've tried to do the best I can, combining a number of factors. Who are the writers most representative of their culture, their time period, their literary movement, of their time period, of their literary movement, uh, how much I personally enjoy teaching the text, because I believe that if you're going to teach students to love literature, you have to use text that you love. And those are really the factors. So I've tried to do the best I can, but no one would do perfect. We're all human, we're all fallible, and there's just so much good stuff to choose from that undoubtedly some good things will be left off that another professor would have included, but that professor probably would have left off some good stuff that I've included. So there's not, perhaps you could say, as tight of a focus in this class as there might be in, say, like a British or American class, or if we just chose to survey French or just chose to survey Nigerian literature. So with that said, with the earlier pieces of literature, we're going to move a little bit faster historically, and once we get to the late 19th, early 20th century, we're going to slow down and look at more of those texts. And I say that so you're aware of kind of the pacing historically and chronologically, but also because the textbook provides these really helpful introductions to periods of time that had great cultural change throughout the world, and where that change also bore out specific literary movements. And so with this lesson too, we're going to look at several of those. We're going to move quickly from the early modern period in East Asia to the Enlightenment throughout Europe, all the way up to the Romantic or Revolutionary period. So we're actually covering 3 periods. And Goethe and Baudelaire will actually be the only 2 authors from the same historical time period in this lesson. As I said, we're moving very fast. But like I said, later on we'll slow down. When we get to the second half of the course, we'll basically be at the 20th century, and we'll look at the 20th century in 3 phases and really only have one historical overview per lesson, whereas this one we have 3 historical overviews. So I'll try to keep that as brief as possible. Hopefully you're reading that in the textbook and just hit the highlights, the most pertinent things for you. And again, that's a decision based on, which text I find most interesting, which text I hope and think you'll find most interesting, and which writers have had the greatest achievements and been the most well-known during their historical time periods. So just want to be upfront with you, all the cards on the table. I've certainly cleared enough ground here. Let's dive in. And so on that note, like I said, first we're going to look at the literatures of early modern East Asia. And there's our poet for early modern East Asia, Matsuo Basho, who we'll talk about in just a minute. But as promised, we're going to look at what were some of the most important things happening in early modern East Asia. And really, what does that phrase, early modern, mean? Because the time period we're covering here is certainly not what people probably think of when they think of modern. And as I said, the question of what defines modern or modernity and the transition from a more earlier kind of way of life to a modern way of life will be one of the prominent themes for this course. So what we consider today quintessentially modern started to emerge in Europe and around the world as early as the 14th century. we'll expand on and build on what is modern in just a minute here. One example would be the invention of the printing press, so a new form of technology. And if you think about things like smartphones and the internet, and particularly something like YouTube, which has radically changed and revolutionized the dissemination of information. Many of you would probably be too young to know what life was like before YouTube, and how people obtained information, say, as recently, as the early 90s. It's quite a difference, and information is much more available to more people in kind of a widespread way now. Well, the printing press had a similar effect, and what we mean here by vernacularization is that most of the texts written and published around this time, the 14th century and the centuries before it, immediately before and after it, were usually written and published in Latin. And so with vernacularization, you had more texts being published in vernacular or local languages, such as English, French, German, Italian, etc., which meant more people had access to more literature. So basically, more of the world being able to read and write and read more things was a hugely modern, and air quotes, development that happened, earlier than people think of when they think of the term modern. So that's one example of modernity happening early in Europe. And as often the case, what happened in Europe happened even earlier in East Asia. So you begin to see new print technologies, particularly in China, but other East Asian countries as early as the 11th century, quite a long time ago, in 300 years before Europe. This led to the mass production of Buddhist scriptures and images. Literacy expanded to social classes beyond the elites with cheaper access to written texts. This comes back to what I said about teaching someone to fish and first teaching them to love the sea. With more texts available because of new print technologies, more people wanted to and did indeed learn to read. Christianity was banned in both China and Japan during this period, so there's been, a long history of, I guess you could say, a lack of religious freedom in these countries. So that's kind of another note here, along with what we've already learned about printing technologies and reading and writing. And in the United States, we talk a lot about the separation of church and state, and how that could potentially, that needs to be reinforced, etc. That comes up a lot. But one thing I think we don't often realize that's so good about the separation of church and state is it really gives everyone who's a U.S. citizen lots of religious freedom. And so if you want to be Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or a Buddhist or a Hindu or an atheist or a Scientologist or a secular evolutionist or whatever you want to believe, everyone believes in something. Whatever it is you believe in, you're free to do that here. In other places of the world, not the case. Getting back to what we said about the rise in print culture, you also saw the rise in popular literature. This is something we don't think about now because everybody reads. People often talk in the U.S. today about, people don't read as much as they used to, but everyone reads on social media. If you walk through an airport, they're filled with bookstores. And so this isn't something we think about a lot. But things like the novel, airport bookstores are filled with novels. That's popular literature. Everyone reads novels. As recent as 200 years ago, not very many people were reading novels. That was a development of, at least in Europe and the Americas, that was a development from about 1850 on forward. So when you have literacy expanding beyond the elite upper class of society, you then have literature becoming popular among the masses, and the masses don't always like the same things as the elites. So you have the emergence of different kinds of literature, which we'll talk about with basho and haiku poetry in just a minute, and also education. Like I said, people want to read, so they need to learn to read because they don't know how. You had education reforms happening as well. And one last comment here. In Japan specifically, there was commercial and cultural exchange between the provinces and the city. So in addition to literacy improving, educational reform, the dissemination of information, and other modern development is a transition from a rural to an urban society. And so there was government policy reform that required some of the government leaders to live in both the rural provinces and the city, the capital here being what is known as Edo or Tokyo. And so that kind of hastened the transition, you could say, from rural to urban in East Asia. And we'll see something similar with the Industrial Revolution later in this lecture in part 3. So that was some background on what was happening in East Asia, really from the 11th century on forward. But, all those things were happening up to the 17th century when our class begins and when Basho was writing. And so we're going to look at Basho now. I've chosen him as the representative of East Asian literature. With the way I plotted out the writers in the course, we're only looking at one East Asian author, at least from this time period. We'll look at other ones, much more recent ones later on. But trying to choose just one writer from this period, I chose Basho because he's really the father of haiku poetry, and he really represents what he did with his writing is a great example. So he represents this transition to popular literature, to more people being able to read and write and have access to text and enjoy literature. So a little bit about Basho himself. He was a socially marginal figure. In other words, he kind of lived on his own and did his thing. And there was a style of poetry called haikai that was popular when he was alive, and in the city, people would really read and write a lot of haikai poetry. And even though he lived more off on his own in a more rural area and kept to himself, he was still very influential in that he actually made changes. He kind of invented his own form of haikai poetry, and it gave way to what we know today so commonly as haiku poetry. And so we'll see what was unique about his style and how it would give way to haiku poetry, and how all of this about him, I just said, relates to what we learned about early modern East Asia during these centuries. He was born into a former samurai family that had fallen low in a small castle town. He developed his taste for haikai poetry while serving the lord of that local castle. He moved to Edo, or Tokyo, the capital, at age 29, and became a haikai master, making his living from teaching poetry. So he was very good at writing poetry, and for at least a part of his life, he was part of these wide circles of authors who wrote haikai poetry in the urban capital. But that didn't last very long. As early as 1680, he retreated to a banana plant hut, which is where he lived most of his life, and from which he took his pen name. Basho is not his birth name. It actually means dwelling place, and so he adopted that as his pen name once he decided to move in to this banana plant hut and kind of become that more marginal figure we know him as, to kind of separate from the society of which he used to be a part in Edo. So he started writing his own brand of haikai poetry rather than just doing the same thing everyone else was doing once he moved into the banana hut. And we'll see what that brand of poetry is like when we analyze the literature. That part of it is travel diary. diary. He started to combine, really the key is he combined poetry and prose. Before it was all verse. But as you've seen if you've done the reading, he interweaved the poetry with his travel diary, and that combination of poetry and prose was unique and new. So I basically just said that. I got a little ahead of myself. And like I said before, they call this linked verse. Basically, one poet trades off verses with another poet, which we see Basho and Sora do in The Narrow Road to the Deep North. And that kind of linked verse, which has had a few different names, including waka and haikai, that was mainly for the elites. What was happening in the city in Edo, that was mainly among the elite, the upper class. So just like we talked about during this time, there's a transition to the middle and lower classes learning to read and write and loving doing it, and Basho played a key role in that by developing a new kind of style of haikai verse that more people read and enjoyed. Basho, what his style kind of opened poetry up to the masses, you could say. The way the textbook says it is his style of poetry caused haikai poetry in general, apologize for the misspelling there, to reach a new degree of freedom. So keep that phrase, freedom, in mind. That's really the term that encapsulates his style of poetry as well as haiku. And so you might not immediately see the connections between Basho's particular style of haikai poetry and what we know today as haiku poetry. But if you keep that word of freedom in mind and pay close attention when we do the close reading in a minute, I think that'll become clear. So there's a couple of distinctions to keep in mind here. Upper class versus the other classes of society, rural versus urban, and a more kind of restricted form of poetry than a freer form of poetry. So keep those three themes in mind as we read. And what I'll just say about haiku is we know it as a certain number of syllables per line, short 3-line poem. In that sense, just thinking of haiku that way is what people in the upper class in the city associated with haikai poetry at Basho's time. But what you'll see is when we read is in Basho's poems throughout The Narrow Road to the Deep North, there's all different lines with different numbers of syllables. So it's really, again, that central theme for this part of the lesson of freedom is really the key here. Haiku today, in grade school, you might learn it and you need to have a certain number of syllables per line, but that's not the way most people in East Asia especially write haiku poetry today. So Basho gave it a freedom it didn't have when it was still locked into the city with the elites. So I've kind of already hit on what some of the threads would be, but let's just we kind of recap them here and add a few more. So The Narrow Road to the Deep North is a journey more so than anything else. But what is it a journey through? Nature, the past, language, with a friend, which is Sora. And that's important to keep in mind because, like I said, these forms of poetry, waka, haikai, and haiku, are linked verse, where there's often trading off of verses between poets. And you'll see how what Basho does is really brilliant because you'll see a part of the text that's prose, poetry, pose, poetry, and it's all linked. There's a similar theme, or it's all kind of depicting one scene, so it's linked, and part of that linking is a connection with a friend. A couple other quick notes. He did a lot of revisions to this text before it was published, so it's kind of an idealized version of his travels rather than what we would probably think of as a true diary, and that's why I prefer to call it a travel narrative rather than a travel diary. And on that note, the genre of travel narrative is a fairly popular genre. You know, when you think of literature, you probably think of fiction, poetry, drama, maybe even mythology or graphic novels, but a piece of literature, a type of literature that scholars are really writing about a lot, is a travel narrative. And one of the goals of this class, as I've stated before, is to read in different genres as we explore the world, not just look at one genre. And so I'm very grateful that we have a travel narrative to look at here, because it's a fascinating style of writing. And that's another reason why I selected Basho for the early modern East Asian portion of the course. And what is a travel narrative? It's really a collection of observations about places. That's a very general definition. But when you have an author, a great author like Basho, in a place, giving his observation, so much can resonate culturally, and you can actually get into big, important questions and themes. So I'm glad you'll get to see a travel narrative here. All right, let's look in more depth at some of these threads by looking at some passages from the text. And in doing that, I really want to see this kind of linked verse thing, and how he's giving his own, how the linked verse thing shows up in prose in a travel narrative, and how in doing that he's giving his own style of poetry that was different from what everyone else was doing at the time, and made him kind of a revolutionary. Right, so here's the first quote, and I have it follows with several poems. So there's a poem immediately after the quote, and then two poems. Again, these are very short, 3-line poems, thinking of like early prototypes of haiku. And so I'm going to skip the prose sections after the first one. So it'll be this short paragraph here, and then 3 poems. Keep in mind that in the actual book, the actual text, there's more prose in between the poems. And if you want to follow along and pause the lecture and read that prose, these are on pages 89 and 90. So, the willow that was the subject of Sego's poem, where a crystal stream flows, still stood in the village of Ashino, on a footpath in a rice field. The lord of the manor of this village had repeatedly said, "I would like to show you this willow," and I had wondered where it was. Today I was able to stand in its very shade. Whole field of rice seedlings planted I part from the willow. Beginnings of poetry, rice planting songs of the deep north. Planting rice seedlings, the hands in the distant past pressing the grass of longing. So all of the themes we talked about so far really come together in just this short section. You have the past, the present, nature, language, all colliding or intersecting in these verses. So one thing I haven't mentioned yet that's important, and why I bring up the past versus the present, is in Basho's writing, as he journeys to these different places, as he sees a place, he thinks of a poet who wrote a poem there before. And then he writes his own poem there, and the two overlap. And so there's this intersection of past and present. And this is just a great example, because there's this famous Japanese poem, from earlier, and he's at the same place, but now he's, you could say, mapping his own experiences onto that earlier experience. And there's this great intersection with nature. The willow gives him shade. The rice planting, the seeds of rice here are kind of like poetry. You can see poems starting to bud. You have a much earlier poet, so when poetry was a newer thing, so you're kind of seeing the birth of poetry, but then at the same time, he's creating his own new style of poetry here. And you can see how, if we were to remove the prose, the poetry would not be nearly as effective. So this new style of poetry he's doing that links or interconnects prose and verse, is not just verse, how it really has value, and the themes are coming through more clearly. All right, going a little further along, we have Another similar passage of prose and verse. When we returned to the shore and took lodgings, I opened the window. It was a 2-story building, and I felt like a traveler, sleeping amid the wind and the clouds. To a strange degree, it was a good feeling. Matsushima, borrow the body of a crane. Cuckoo, Sora. And so you see you have Basho's prose and Sora's poem here, one immediately right after the other. I talked before about the linked verse, and so what was happening with the more traditional version of haikai poetry at this time in the cities was you'd have these elite poet writers from the upper class kind of writing together, trading off verses. It was almost kind of a competition amongst friends. Here you have Basho describing in prose what it's like. He's up high. He's got the window open in this, essentially like a hotel, basically, with the window open up high, and so he can feel the winds and the clouds, and it was a strange but good feeling. And then you have Sora talking about the birds native to that region. They hear a cuckoo, but the crane is supposed to be the bird that's native to the region of Matsushima. So you have nature showing up in the poem again, but also you have Sora describing the birds that are there, and Basho describing what it feels like to be up high, almost like a bird. So these two verses are this prose and this verse, that's the important part. Prose and verse are connected here by two different writers. And so I might seem like I'm kind of harping the same points over and over again, but what I'm trying to show you is how Basho and Sora here take traditional parts of haikai verse, the linked nature of it, and update it. Prose and verse, not just verse. All right, a little bit more here. Couple of prose observations that give us good insights to what Basho is doing here. Again, one could see, scattered widely in the shadow of the pines, people who had turned their backs on the world. They lived quietly in grass huts, the smoke from burning rice ears and pine cones rising from the huts. I didn't know what kind of people they were, but I was drawn to them. And when I approached, the moon was reflected on the sea, and the scenery changed again, different from the afternoon landscape. So what I'll say about this is Basho is an everyman, not part of the elite or the upper or the aristocratic class. Remember, he kind of spent some time with those more elite writers, elite not in the quality of the writing and their position in society, but then chose to go live by himself. And so he kind of made himself a marginal figure, but that's important. He's inventing a new style of poetry here that makes poetry accessible to the masses. An aristocrat wouldn't be able to do that. If the poetry is going to be revolutionized in form and popularized among the masses, you need an everyman to do that. One other prose section here. Several hundred ferry boats gathered in the inlet. Human dwellings fought for space on the shore, and the smoke from the ovens rose high. It never occurred to me that I would come across such a prosperous place. So the phrase I think is really key here is human dwellings fought for space on the shore. And you see the encroachment of modernity here. I talked about the urban and the rural. Most of the places through which Basho is traveling are rural. But here you have human dwellings fighting for space. And he never occurred to him that he would come across such a prosperous place. So you're starting to see kind of the encroach of the urban or the modern upon rural space here. And what's really important, I think, is you have Basho connecting with the past all throughout his journey. But then you have but he's updating the past. He's writing his own poems inspired by the past in a more modern style. And then you have modernity through the form of urbanism creeping in on the rural here. So what you could say their journey is a journey into modernity. Right. Finally, now that we've pulled on the threads and looked more in depth at some language from the text, What do we learn from it? By intermixing prose and verse, Basho creates a new genre, and I call this poetic travel narrative, which is his own unique style of poetry. And we've talked before about how that's important and how there's a sense of freedom here. He's not following the rules of customs of haikai poetry. So as he becomes a famous poet, and he was very famous. If you just look him up on Google, it'll say he was the most famous Japanese poet of this time period. So as he becomes famous, people see the differences between his style of haikai poetry and what everyone else, the elites, were doing, and they say, hey, I can kind of write however I want. And so poetry then extends out to the masses in a large part because of his efforts. As an everyman and poetic pioneer, Basho rescues poetry from the elite aristocratic class. His innovative style and use of everyday scenes and language gives poetry a sense of freedom that opens it up to a wider range of social classes. So that's mainly what I just said, fairly self-explanatory. As Basho travels into the North Country and visits the poetic sites of the past, but also puts his own poetic stamp on them and encounters modern forms of architecture, he journeys out of the past and into modernity, a journey his readers in much of East Asia was making at the time, and that we will make in this course. So Basho is really the perfect writer to begin with in terms of looking at the literature chronologically. I know we technically started with Flaubert, but now we're going forward chronologically in that he's kind of serving as a transitionary writer, helping his culture and his people transition from the past into the present, to pre-modern, into the modern. He's helping people make that leap. We're going to make that leap in this class. He's the earliest writer, and his style of writing is probably the earliest type of writing we'll look at, but we can still see the inroads of modernity. And so as we ask the question, what does it mean to be modern? How did becoming modern affect people all throughout the world? Basho gives us a good first glimpse. And his poetry brilliantly reconciles all these binaries we've talked about: past and present, human and nature, pre-modern and modern, elite and everyman. His poetry brings those things together rather than just seeing them as the opposites. He reconciles them. And finally, I want to make a note of, it should say pedagogical learning questions, it should be plural, and theses. So the idea is you read, you make note of some threads, you pull on those threads as you revisit the important passages. Eventually you come up with a thesis. So in modeling that approach to literary analysis for you, I do want to give you theses at the end, but I don't want to end any lecture with the impression that I've figured it all out about this text. And again, like I said, I don't want to cover everything because I want to leave much for you to discover and discuss in your threads and thesis and on the discussion board. I want to just be a springboard to the discussion board and for you in your papers at each level, going from this lecture to your own threads and thesis, to the discussion board, to your own papers. You should be taking the ideas a step further each time, and so that you have a really unique, original idea, new idea by the time you get to writing the paper. And so I also want to leave you with questions, not just theses. And so the one question I have for the Narrow Road to the Deep North is, what do we make of Sora's role in the text? He's certainly Basho's companion, and he helps him achieve that linked part of the style, which is very important because he can't abandon haikai poetry completely. He has to build a bridge to modernity, and so he has to have some of the old combined with the new. And so Sora helps him keep that linked part. But I think there's a lot more going on here. I think Sora is very important. And so as you reflect on the text and compose your threads and theses, and I look forward to reading them, and you're certainly welcome to write on whatever you want, but I'm just very curious to see what you think of Sora, because his role is definitely a part of the text I perhaps didn't explore as thoroughly as others that seems very important. So I look forward to reading your posts, and I hope you enjoyed the lecture.